we're about to do take 3
Yes.
of day
Yeah.
4 of the podcast. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast from the team at ABC Andover Baptist Church, all about heaven. And we've been digging around in this subject for 3 days so far. We've got quite a lot more to go, but thank you for joining us for day 4. My name's Chris. I'm the senior minister at Andover Baptist Church, have the privilege of leading the team, of whom Becky is a part. And Becky is with me again today. Say
Hello.
hi, Becky.
Hello.
Becky heads up this whole area of our church life that we call next steps, and this is one of those next steps. And this was one of Becky's ideas for how we can encourage people in our church community, but actually beyond our church community as well, who may be exploring faith, to take a next step on that journey of faith, no matter where it is in that journey that we're starting from. So, Becky, do you want to just kind of recap a little bit about why we're doing this, and then introduce us to kind of our theme for the day?
Yeah, so we're in this heaven series, and we've been talking about, so far in every episode, we've been coming back to this idea that what we believe about heaven and what we believe about what's coming after we die, what's coming in the future, informs how we live today. And it changes so much of how we see the world and see ourselves and the hope that we can have for today. And so today we're going to begin to unpack a little bit more this idea that heaven is not just a hope for something up in the sky after we die, but that the New Testament paints this picture of heaven as being a future we can look forward to on earth, as in earth will one day look more and more like heaven, and ultimately will become this picture of something new, of the thing that God created and intended for it to be. And to do that today, and we've been diving into a Bible passage every day to help us with this idea about heaven. Today we're diving into 1 Corinthians, the letter of 1 Corinthians, so called because there is a second letter called 2 Corinthians, and they are both written by this guy Paul, who we have already met so far. And Paul, if you are listening to this episode and you haven't listened to the previous ones, let me catch you up on Paul quickly. So he was a persecutor of Christians. So he lived in the 1st century, and he was very angry when the message of Jesus first appeared in the world, and he wanted to blot it out. And he persecuted and hunted down and even killed Christians, and then had this dramatic conversion experience, which ultimately led to him devoting his life to sharing the good news about Jesus with people all over the place. And today we're diving into a letter he writes to a community he had established in a place called Corinth, which you can still go to Corinth today, can't you, in Greece?
You can, yes.
And yes,
Have you been?
I have not, but
No.
I'm planning to go at some point in the next 12 months, I
Oh,
hope.
really? Excellent.
So yes, I'll be able to say more about Corinth at that point. But
Yeah.
so he writes this letter to this community who he had established in their faith, but then they've started to get in, well, a fair amount of mess. They've begun to drift and kind of lose sight of what's most important. And actually the behaviors that Paul addresses in this letter tell us that this community has, they're in a bit of a relational mess with one another, and they are maybe losing sight of where they're supposed to be headed, what they should be setting their sights on in terms of what they should look like as a community and what God has called them to. So do you want to pick up, Chris, and take us into today's passage?
Yeah. So one of the things that Paul does through this letter is try to kind of draw them back to the fundamentals, if you like, of their faith, of what they've believed in, of what he has taught them, because they've kind of drifted away from that. So the bit that we're going to look at today is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And it's the whole chapter is about resurrection. And he starts by talking about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And I think this is really interesting. Again, we talked about this yesterday or on day 3 of the podcast about how so often these first followers of Jesus are grounding their ideas of heaven in the resurrection of Jesus that, in Peter's case, which is who we were talking about yesterday, he'd seen with his own eyes, and in Paul's case, which he had heard about firsthand from people who had been there and who had seen it. So he starts this whole chapter with talking about resurrection of Jesus, and then he moves on to talk about the resurrection of everybody else into heaven, which is this kind of picture that the New Testament paints for us over and over again about us human beings being resurrected into heaven as well. So that's a little bit of background to chapter, and we're going right to the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, to the last few verses of the chapter, starting at verse 54. So I'm going to read that again, as we've been saying all the way through this series. If you've got a Bible with you, love for you to follow along. If you haven't, don't worry, we're going to read it so you can follow along in that way. So here's what Paul says to the Corinthians in that context of talking about resurrection. He says, when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you, always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain.
Mm.
So, should we talk about a couple of words
Yeah, I've got
in
some
that? Go on, and you
questions.
go first.
So, when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, is he talking about food that's not canned, or like what's that about?
Well, I'll be interested in your view on this too. I think he's talking about us. I think he's
Mm.
talking about, human beings, and indeed maybe even more than that. He might be talking about the whole of like the created world, which is, we've used some language from a couple of days ago, decaying. Ultimately, we know, even though we might not want to admit it, we know we are ultimately perishing. Ultimately, one day, the truth is, we will all die. And I think he's saying the same thing he says in the next phrase, the mortal with immortality. So perishable, mortal, things that won't be here forever. But when they've been clothed with something else, imperishable and immortality, then they'll go on forever. So
Wow.
that's. Do you think the same thing? Is that
Yeah,
your
yeah,
reading
yeah,
of the same
yeah.
thing? Yeah.
And it's an incredible, before we go on to the next question I had
Mm,
about some of the words in this passage, that's an incredible thing. We're talking in this series about, like, even if you may not believe in heaven, you may be still figuring that out. And we're so glad you're listening to this podcast, even if
absolutely.
you haven't decided what you believe about that. But isn't that something that all of us have a desire for? That something won't end,
Yeah.
and that something won't perish and fade away,
Yeah.
but that something will go on,
Yeah.
and that this possibility that this passage throws up in front of us, that what has been perishable, and most of all ourselves, we are perishable, will be transferred into something that goes on forever.
Yeah. And I really love the phrase has been clothed with the imperishable, because that sounds to me like kind of something being put on. Does that mean, well, which clothes is, I guess? But actually, I think that's quite a kind of a poetic, when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable. So the thing that is imperishable, and in this, I think he's believing it's God, comes and kind of wraps up, surrounds, clothes the perishable. It becomes imperishable. So it's almost like, I don't know whether this is too kind of Harry Potter-esque, but it's almost like, God is cloaking us in the cloak of imperishability,
The
the
fourth
clothes of
Deathly Hallows.
imperishability.
Yeah.
So yeah, I find that language really compelling. I
Mm,
love that.
yeah. So then, it's interesting. Paul says, "The saying that is written will come true.
Mm,
Death has been swallowed up in victory."
yes.
What's he referring to there?
Yeah, well, he's referring to some scriptures that he would have been very aware of, having grown up, being trained as a rabbi in the Jewish faith. He's referring to a prophecy actually given by an Old Testament prophet called Isaiah, and he's quoting that. So that, I think, is the saying that he's referring to.
Yeah, yeah. I teed that question up, Chris, so that I would have an excuse then to share that passage from Isaiah,
Yeah,
because what it
great.
goes on to say is incredible. So the what Paul's quoting is and he would expect when he quotes that for other people to clock that passage is what he's referring to, and then think about the other things that passage says. And it says, "He will, he being God, swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord," that is the Lord who rules over everything, "will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from the earth. The Lord has spoken." So that's what Paul is quoting there, which, yeah, is
Yeah,
quite an amazing picture.
brilliant, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, Becky, we've been, as we've been sort of going through this each day, as we've been looking at these different passages of the Bible, we've been asking 5 questions that not only are we hoping is helpful in the context of this podcast, but is also helpful when people are engaging with the Bible. And we love doing that, and we love to encourage other people to do that. So the first question we ask is, what's the context? Well, I think we've kind of talked about that. Resurrection, Paul addressing people in Corinth, etc., etc. So the second question we're asking is, what's the point?
Mm,
So what do you think is the point of these particular verses that we're looking at today?
yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, it seems to be that Paul is saying that the current way of things, where things perish, where things are not immortal,
Mm-mm.
where death is a reality,
Yeah,
and where things end, um, is not a permanent reality, and it will one day be replaced by a permanent reality which overshadows the thing we've been used to, and especially death that we have all been used to. That that picture of it being swallowed up is almost like it's like no match for what God will introduce into the future is just going to completely overshadow
so good.
the reality that has been present in all of our lives,
Yeah,
which is the reality of death, the reality of things coming to an end. Um,
yeah,
and that is when Paul talks about victory, that will be the victory,
yeah,
that life will win out over death.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. That's so good. I love that explanation of being swallowed up. I think that's really helpful. I mean, I'm just going to echo everything that you say. I mean, the only sort of other thing that strikes me is that word victory, and it's used twice. Where, O death, is your victory? So I think, without God, without Jesus, and this is an argument I know we would make as Christians, but without that, it does look like death wins, right? So it happens to all of us. It's the end of our earthly life, all that kind of stuff. So without any God in this, death wins.
Yeah.
So Paul is saying, so where, O death, is your victory? Well, now he's saying that in Jesus, and he says a bit later on, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So there's this contrast between the victory of death and actually the victory of God through Jesus. So death doesn't have to win because Jesus has achieved a victory over death. And again, that's where I think the context of resurrection is really important. How do we know Jesus has achieved victory over death? Well, because he died and came back to life 3 days later. So death is not the end. Death does not win over Jesus, and it doesn't have to win over us. And then I think there's that whole idea. So if death doesn't win, if there is a victory somewhere else in Jesus, then he says, you who believe in Jesus, who are following Jesus, stand firm, don't be moved, and instead give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because your labor is not in vain, because ultimately Jesus has achieved this victory over death.
Mm.
And yeah,
So I've got a question.
yes,
Paul seems to be saying not just one day people will be that you'll end up in heaven
mm,
and there won't be any death there. He seems to be saying in the future there will be a point when there isn't any death, full stop,
yes,
not just no death in heaven.
yeah.
So what's he saying?
Well, I think he's leaning into this picture of heaven that we've talked about on previous days, that we're talking about through the Sunday series that we're doing as well, that ultimately all of creation is restored, and that death is only present in creation because the kingdom of God is not fully present on earth. Because the story of God says that because human beings, we've turned our backs on God, and so on and so forth, that there is now this breakdown in relationship. But one day, God is going to restore the whole thing. So heaven and earth will join together, and that we will experience heaven on earth. The whole of creation is going to be restored and renewed, and death will be no more, because now this will be the perfect realization of the kingdom of heaven, which we're only see in part now, is in a broken form because of us. But when it's fully restored, death doesn't exist anymore. Because it doesn't exist in the perfect realization of the kingdom of heaven, because The perishable is now clothed with imperishability, the mortal with immortality. And so there is no more death. And so death has no more hold over us, has no more pain and grief for us. I think that's what Paul is clearly. Paul believes that to the heart of his being. Jesus believed it, and we can believe it too.
So we're going to skip ahead to the what's the difference question off the back of what you've just said. So what difference does it make when we start thinking about heaven not just as something that happens separate from earth and is kind of like not something we'll really think about until we get there,
Yeah.
and heaven being something that will one day be joined with earth, and the earth will be restored in that way?
Yeah.
What difference do you think that makes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a few, and I definitely think we can keep coming back to the theme of hope that we have all the way through. It gives us a hope of what will be, and I think again, Paul alludes with it. He says, if you ultimately believe that death doesn't have the ultimate victory, then the sting of death, the pain of death, and literally that word would have meant like almost like a scorpion sting or an bee sting or something like that. That pain that's not there anymore. It doesn't need to have the same impact. Of course, we'll always experience the loss when we lose people, but there is a hope beyond that that takes away some of the pain of death. So I think that's definitely one difference that this makes, that we can have a hope even in the midst of our grief, that death is not the end. But I think it also means that if God is going to transform and renew this world and us, then what we do with our world and ourselves and how we treat each other matters now. And you had a great phrase for this. Can you remember what your phrase? We were talking a little bit before we
Yeah.
started. What was your phrase?
Well, just that oftentimes when we think about like, oh, God's going to make everything new in the end, or we're going to go to heaven, it can make us think like, okay, so how does that connect to what happens now? And I just find it helpful to think that it's not about God setting a restart. It's about a renewal. It's
Yes.
about, so it's not about, okay, blank sheet of paper, starting from scratch again.
Yeah.
It's not a restart. It's a restore.
Yeah. Yeah. And that means that what we do with it now
Mm,
is really important.
mm,
And so there's a couple of differences there. Hope, living in the light of death not being the end,
mm,
which I think a lot of us would say that we fear death.
mm,
Well, actually, it doesn't need to have quite such a hold on us. And then what we do with the present world
mm,
and how we treat each other really matters,
mm.
because it's not going to be wiped away and it's going to be a renewal of what is.
Yeah,
And so that makes that really
yeah,
important.
yeah.
Mm-mm.
So we've been asking whether we can get these passages into a tweet.
Yes.
What's the couple of
Yes,
sentence
yes.
summary of what's going on here?
Well, how about this? This is what I was thinking about. Jesus achieved victory over death when he rose again, and that same resurrection awaits us, and therefore that brings us hope.
Mm, mm, So because Jesus achieved it, we can believe it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, there we
I
go.
didn't even
There
mean
it
for
is.
that to rhyme.
You've had a
It's
few rhyming bits
amazing what
today.
happens once you're on air.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
S-
yeah.
so then the final question we keep asking is: so
Yeah.
we've asked what's different, what's next, what's next? Well, for me, the what's next is this is a challenge to be seeing the beauty that is already in our world, which gives us a foretaste of what it's going to be like when God renews it, seeing the beauty in other human beings, and what foretaste that gives us of what it's going to be like when we're all resurrected, and actually the opportunity we have in taking care of our world, and of each other, in bringing a glimpse of heaven to earth now. And so I think that there's a challenge there for us to think about those things that we often talk about in terms of how we're taking care of this amazing planet that we get to live on, and that there is a heavenly inspired mandate for us to take care of what's entrusted to us, and to appreciate it now.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm just thinking as you say that, the encouragement in that as well for anybody listening is that your investment in the good of others and in the good of the world isn't wasted,
Mm,
and it won't be
yeah,
wasted. And I think often we can find ourselves feeling discouraged or disheartened because we don't see we don't see the fruits of
Yeah.
our labor.
Yeah.
But, this passage reminds us your labor in the
It's not
Lord
in
is
vain.
not in vain,
Yeah.
that it won't be wasted, that you trying to bring good into the world and you doing good to others is something that God's building on that,
Yeah.
and he will bring that to completion one
Yeah.
day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because it's not in vain.
Mm,
Yeah, really, really helpful.
yeah.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's been an encouragement to you today as you listen to this podcast. And we're going to keep going on this journey as we figure out more about heaven and the difference it makes to our lives right now. Anything else you wanted to add, Chris?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, just as always, we'd love to carry on the conversation with people. So
Yes.
wherever you're engaging with this, or I think you said on day one, we have a ABC Online Community Facebook group. If you're not a part of that, you can ask to become one, and we can carry on the conversation there.
Mm,
And just to say, I think we should always say this when we're talking about grief and loss and death. If that's you today, if you're in the middle of that and experiencing grief, then our thoughts and our prayers are with you. And we hope that in some way this is something of hope to hold on to in the midst of all of that,
mm.
that death is not the end and doesn't have the ultimate victory. But if you want to talk about that more or ask us to pray for you, then please just get in touch with us, and we would love to do that.
Yeah, that's good. Good. Thanks so much, Chris.
But thank you. It's been another great one. Thank you.
Cool. And we'll catch you on the next episode.